set. So, the last thing we're going to talk about is the return of Godzilla, which was filmed in what year?
1984.
So it's a Godzilla versus man movie. So there's no other fucking monsters. And that one was subtitled, not dubbed. So
Because it was actually never released in America.
technically, there's a what was it? It was a pirated version that was officially released.
In 1985, they brought over Godzilla, what's called Godzilla, Return of Godzilla in Japan. They brought it over in 1985, the year after, as Godzilla 1985. And they did the same thing to it that they did to Godzilla King of Monsters in 1954. And they actually recast Raymond Burr. They dragged out Raymond Burr. He was still alive at that point. And they filmed a whole bunch of new scenes and recut the movie and made it more or less the same thing that they did in the original film, which is an entirely different movie. But it contains a lot of the same sequences. It did not go over well with American audiences, mostly due to the recuts, because the way they recut it was America Saves Everybody, which didn't really go over well with Godzilla fans and didn't really seem convincing due to the way they recut it to non-Godzilla fans. And since then it has not been re-released in America except on VHS in that recut version. So the only way to get it, unfortunately, is buying it online using less than reputable resources. And
so during the creation of this film, a little less by the release date, but it takes time to make these things. The Cold War was in its throes.
Full swing, yeah.
And you see Japan here as the factor, and they're the ones who ultimately have to deal with Godzilla. But when you see the UN talks, it's like America and Russia arguing over telling Japan what to do, which is a really bizarre thing to see in what's very clearly a Japanese film, all of the zeitgeist that we talk about. But it comes around when the Japanese, was it Prime Minister?
Prime Minister, yes.
Gives this inspiring talk about, you're telling us what to do, but what of what you ask of us? And because the point is that America and Russia agree, which is this point of, ooh, America and Russia agrees, what the that they should use nuclear weapons on Godzilla from orbit. I don't know where'd that come from? Is that
Star Wars program?
There was lasers.
Yes, but they also talk about orbiting nuclear satellites.
That was lasers.
It was
lasers.
It wasn't masers. It was actual lasers. Reagan and his crazy shit. That's what it was.
Right.
Oh no, politics.
Yeah, and then so it's this weird thing. It's also weird to see. It's more apparent in the Man versus Godzilla movies, the horror, where you see them trying to develop these human characters in the face of it, because the Godzilla scenes cost impossible
The majority
amounts.
of the budget,
Right, so they have to make... How long is the average Godzilla movie?
Average Godzilla film is around 90 minutes, sometimes a little bit longer, around 100 minutes.
So, yeah, and then... But the Godzilla scene's only probably 15 minutes?
15 to 30, typically. So the majority of Godzilla films don't feature Godzilla. And the reason for that is because it's expensive to film. Also, it's really dangerous. If any of you feel, like I said, like that documentary I mentioned earlier called Bringing Godzilla Down to Size, watch it. It has some really awesome testimonials from Takahiro Nakajima, who's the guy who was actually in the suit acting as Godzilla for all of the movies from the 50s to the 70s. He's got some really amazing, really scary horror stories about some of the stuff that happened to him. He nearly drowned twice. A couple of times he blacked out and had to go to the hospital due to dehydration. There's a bunch of other things that happened. It was actually really terrifying working in the suit. So they didn't film it a lot because it was dangerous, it was expensive, and while it may have been the money shot for all of the Godzilla films, it was one of those things where, ironically, it worked to the favor. Because the less you featured Godzilla, the less people got sick of him. So...
And one of the interesting things of this is that you have to develop all these characters, but of course they're talking about Godzilla, but there's other things that kind of never fully pay off or never really come to fruition or ultimately kind of wonky, especially because there's no real continuing characters. There's
Right.
a couple throughout a couple of the different continuities, but...
And a lot of it, what it comes down to be honest with you, is how do you make a movie about a giant monster entertaining when you can't put the giant monster in it 90% of the time? And the way you do that is you make it a mystery film. So, ironically, a lot of people who like mystery movies usually like Godzilla movies. I'm actually one of those people. And the reason why is because it's a mystery about trying to solve, why is Godzilla awakening? Why is he coming back to Japan now? What is driving him? And so that's what it's about. Case in point, one of my favorite ones, my actual absolute favorite Godzilla film, which is Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla in 1974, is pretty much a mystery film. It's about this ancient artifact that gets stolen by this mysterious group of people. There's an Interpol agent involved, an archaeologist involved, and they're all trying to track down why this thing is so necessary. And you eventually realize it's Godzilla, so it's eventually an alien conspiracy, because that's Godzilla films. They always end up as an alien conspiracy. Don't ask me why.
Also, it's a Mecha Godzilla, so someone has to pilot Godzilla, and he loves mecha shit, which
I do love
satisfies
mecha
a weird
but Mecha
sexual
Godzilla...
thing. Someone's inside Godzilla, making it do what they want. It's all there. It's
You know
all
what? I don't
subtext.
bring up your sexual preferences in this thing. Why are you bringing up mine? Personally, I feel really called out right now.
It's relevant to the Godzilla thing. Mine's not Godzilla.
No, it's not Godzilla.
We'll talk about Ninja Turtles next time.
Deal. In any case, the point is that when it comes to Godzilla films, it's more of like a mystery setup. And so you have this sort of thing going on. And that's the way they make up for the fact that you can't really see Godzilla in 90% of the film.
Another interesting byproduct of the fact that they can't have Godzilla, and so they talk about it as the mystery idea, is they treat Godzilla with a certain reverence. It's like a walking natural disaster, kind of akin to the Hulk, except not as mortifying for some reason. Like, they recognize what's happening, but they're also in awe of it, kind of like a beautiful volcano explosion. Volcanoes tie very heavily into Godzilla, partially because Japan. But so there's that aspect as well. But it's kind of bizarre because they kind of toe that line, and that's something that's universal, I believe, throughout all of Godzilla's many incarnations.
Yes. When it comes to Godzilla, it's one of those things where Godzilla is something people are constantly in awe of, and it's the idea of, in 1998, when they released Godzilla, Toho Studios released a press release saying that Godzilla was not Godzilla in the American film, so he's known as Zilla, just Zilla in the Japanese films. And the reason why that is because they say they took the god out of Godzilla. And it's the same thing. Godzilla may be a force of natural disaster, but like Matt was saying with volcanoes, it's this awe-inspiring thing. Whereas the Hulk is, a human, more or less a human size. He's about, 8 feet, 9 feet tall?
Well, yeah, I mean, taller than pretty much any human, but it roughly, would fit in a room.
Yeah, I mean, he's, giant size, but he's not, gargantuan like Godzilla is. So
Right.
when it comes to the Hulk, he's a terrifying force of destruction, but he's tiny, so it's not as big of a thing. Whereas you see Godzilla march on a city, and it's the same thing that Lovecraft tried to inspire when he wrote about Cthulhu. When you have something that big, it inspires this sense of awe that you just don't get from anything else. And that's part of the reason why he was called Godzilla.
Yeah, it's a scale.
Right. Which, one quick note on that, if I can interject. So Godzilla in the original Japanese is called Gojira. Gojira is a combination of two words, which is the Japanese word for gorilla, which is actually just Gorira, and the Japanese word for whale, which is Kujira. And the reason why they wanted to do whale was because whale is aquatic and large, so they wanted to get that implication of size. And they did Gorilla because they were trying to make a King Kong film, if you wanted to be honest. So,
Did King Kong predate Godzilla?
yes, King Kong was released in 1936, Godzilla was released in 1954.
By a bit. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
So anyway, the point is that, when it comes to Gojira or Godzilla, when they brought him over to America, they called him Godzilla because Zilla sounds like lizard, and God is the same thing. You want to imply scale and size and awe.
God lizard.
Sort of. Anyway, so Matt, I wanted to ask you a question real quick. So one of the things, the two movies I decided to show you were Return of Godzilla and Godzilla vs. Destroyer, which I know a lot of Godzilla fans might find questionable to show you those two.
Yeah.
But I felt like watching the original 1954 Godzilla might not be appropriate for the comics, because while it is a key point, a lot of what the comics I am imagining are going to be part of is going to be the newer films. And so I wanted to ask, like, based on what you saw, how much does all this tie into the comics? Like, which ones? Like, the later films or the newer films?
I've only read, really, the one comic and, like, some previews of a couple others, so I'm not as versed. Because there's a lot coming out now. Even right now, there's, like, at least 3 Godzilla comics running.
Mm-hmm.
Including the one which is only a miniseries. But, they kind of run the gambit. Because, I mean, part of it is, you need comics, you need spectacles, so a lot of the verses is probably playing in more heavily because you need more monsters.
Mm-hmm.
Especially because, horror in comics, there's a long tradition, but the idea of a Godzilla horror movie of, like, humans versus Godzilla without any other interjection doesn't really play well in a comic. You can only go so far with it.
Which, one quick note here that both of us should mention. When we say horror Godzilla, we're not meaning, like, horror in the sense of Alien or Aliens or any of that stuff.
Or paying for sex.
Or that. The idea behind horror in Godzilla has never been the idea of shock frights, the idea of things jumping out at you or parasites, well, except for that one movie. But the point is, when it comes to Godzilla, the idea of the scariness is your inability to fight against it. The military throws all of its weapons at it. It doesn't work. And it's just, that's the idea. That's what made Godzilla horrifying back in the day. It was just this unstoppable force. So, whereas modern horror tends to do with things on the smaller scale, things that you can't fight against because they're so small, in Godzilla, and especially during the 1950s, during the time of classic giant monster films, the idea was you can't fight against it because it's so big. And that is a trend that started to change, specifically, in my opinion, in 1979 with Alien and Ridley Scott.
Well, so, Godzilla being a byproduct of A, Japan, and B, the 50s.
Also nuclear and atomic
right.
energy and weapons at the time.
The matter of scale comes a lot more into possession. Because with, like, the internet age and all that, if it's not personal, it's not even relevant. You don't even care because how is it going to affect you? But, coming out of World War II, the Cold War, it was these big things, these big ideas affecting not necessarily you, but your nation that were scary, because the idea of personal identification to horror wasn't as necessary to necessarily frighten you, because people, the idea of nationalism and all that was very much still a thing. The idea of globalism was not really there yet. And so that idea frightened you more because your personal identity was more tied to your nation at the time. And so the idea of buildings being knocked over and all that is a lot scarier, whereas now it's like destruction, sure, but is that my block? Like,
Yeah. And also the idea of being desensitized to it. A lot of times
sure.
We've seen the Capitol building blown up so many freaking times in movies, especially like in Independence Day and whatnot, that it's almost completely desensitized us.
Well, yeah, and also, the idea of effects. Now, we're so hyper-aware and all that, but the original Godzilla movie, much like the original Dracula or Frankenstein, was very scary now in the day, but now, we're seeing through the effects and all this, and we're so hyper-aware of things that it's less scary because, in a lot of ways, the general populace is more literate and more aware and more aware of, like, special effects and that sort of deal, so kind of the curtain's been pulled no matter what you do.
Right. And one quick thing here before we finish up. The part of the reason why Godzilla fans really love Godzilla movies, because that might have been a question in all of you's minds right now, is why does anyone like Godzilla even? It's because partially you grew up with it, so it's nostalgic. But another part of it, at least for me, is I love the practical effects. I mean, don't get me wrong, CGI does some fantastic things. And it's made possible a lot of movies that weren't possible before. I'm actually a big Transformers fan as well, and that being said, there's some issues I have with the films. The ones by Michael Bay.
I like the asses. That's as far as I got.
Oh, I don't know what that means.
I saw Megan Fox ass, then I stopped watching.
Oh. Well, you did the right thing, sir. In any case, when it comes to any of the Godzilla films, part of the reason why people like them is because of the practical effects. There's no CG, there's no special effects in the sense of just computer-generated anything. And anytime you do see CG in a Godzilla film, it's never to replace the practical effects. It's always to add to the guy in the suit and to make that better. And that's the way I feel it should be, personally. I mean, practical effects in many cases are a lost art. You watch these old movies and you see these miniature cities that were built by hand over a period of months just to be destroyed, and they had to be destroyed in just the right way. Pyrotechnics had to be timed exactly right. There's an engineering aspect to it that you don't get in modern films. That's not to discredit anyone who works in CGI. That's hard work too, and I totally admit that. But the fact of the matter is that
they're right.
Huh?
If they do it right.
It's true, yes. But the point is that, you know, there's a practical effects are like seeing a magic stage show as opposed to seeing a laser light show. The laser light show might be cool. It might be awesome. You got these cool laser timed music on the scene, and you might have 3D holographic effects. You might have things suspended in smoke to create things like that. That's really great. But practical effects, the idea of the traditional magic show of levitating someone or making a tiger appear out of thin air, that also has its own appeal. And it's the same idea with Godzilla films. You know, CG is great and all, but practical effects have this classic style of stage magic you don't get in modern movies.
And the best movies now use both.
Yes. Case in point, like Inception is one of the ones I'm thinking of that had a lot of CGI and practical effects. Case in point, the rotating room. That was all a practical effect.
And a great breaking point is if you've watched the Matrix movies, the first one used, I mean, certainly CGI at some points, but it also used a lot of camera effects. But
yes.
the later ones didn't so much. And that's why they look a lot more hokey.
He's on his fourth beer. Just getting that out there.
Fourth.
Yeah, this isn't four.
It's for you. And so, I mean, the CGI can do a lot of things that practical effects can't, but practical effects can bring the immersion in a way CGI effects like never can and never have been able to. Maybe someday, but we're so far off that it's the grandkids of my loins, like.
Which I fear that day with every bit of my soul. I can tell you all right now.
Fuck grandkids, it's the kids that I'm worried about.
I'm worried about all of the above. Anything involving your loins bothers me. I'm not gonna lie.
Is that our end point?
I think so.
Okay.
So anyways, thanks to everyone for watching. I know this ran a little bit long.